Alright, good morning or afternoon everyone, wherever you may be. I am Meridian P or Doochman on YouTube or Lichess, depending on where you look. Now, today we're going to be talking about adoption. Adoption in chess is when you beat someone 10-0, and today I pulled off my very first adoption in bullet chess, or chess which is 1 minute with 0 seconds of increment. So today we're going to be talking about those games. Let's just get started with game 1. I'm playing against JRTK73 from, I believe that is Australia or New Zealand. Great. Alright, so I have the black pieces and let's just get started. E4, E5, knight F3, very standard. Knight C6, once again, very standard stuff. And bishop C4, the Italian game. Knight to F6, the two knights defense. Here there are many moves, including D3, some kind of Ponziani with C3, as well as I believe, no, that's not a move. It's not my move. Yes, the knight G5, fried liver. So D3 is played, bishop to C5, castles, and C3, the Giuco Pianissimo. So here, very standard stuff include this, and this for black. These are very standard plans. And I go A6, of course, to go B5, and of course opening a square for my bishop. H3, H6, just stopping his bishop from coming to G5. H3 here is kind of useless because my bishop is currently blocked in by this pawn. B4, bishop to A7, as planned, rook E1, and now B5, another part of my plan. Bishop to B3 and D6. Just opening my bishop up. Of course, there aren't exactly many squares right now, but these could come in handy later. Rook to E8, A takes B5, A takes B5, and now both of our rooks are staring at each other. Now, yes, I could take here with check, and this opens a discovered attack to this undefended rook. I do not see it, so after knight b to d2, I play bishop to b7, defending my rook and preparing to move this bishop. Right here, I realize that, wait, I can take on f2, and it's a check. So, knight to f1, bishop takes f2 with check, king to f2, and rook takes a1, winning the exchange, and here my opponent resigned. So currently the score is 1-0 in my favor. So let's take a look at the second game. I have the white pieces, e4, c5, the Sicilian Defense. Right here my rapid repertoire is something with d4, of course c takes d4, d3, I'll just show you. d4, d takes c3, c takes d4, c3, d takes c4, and knight takes. And there's a very standard line in the Smith-Morra. So I don't play this. Instead, I opt for the, oopsies, let's just pretend that didn't happen. Yes, so here I opt for knight f3, going for the open Sicilian, because my hand was already on the knight. So d4, no, d6, d4, and c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6. Very standard stuff, attacking this pawn. Standard move, knight c3. G6, the Dragon Sicilian, and I play bishop to d2. After bishop to d7, I go for bishop to b5. After bishop d7, I just take, chop the knight, and knight b takes d7. Here I castle, we both castle, and I play knight f3, just getting my knight out of the way of any e5 push. Now after knight to c5, I play rook to e1, both knights are attacking, both knights are attacking this pawn. After a6, I play bishop to e3, hanging this pawn, but my opponent doesn't notice. He plays b5, and after bishop takes c5, d takes c5, I play queen takes d8. After rook takes, I play a3. After knight to g4, I kick out the knight, comes here, and I trade. Bishop takes e5, and I play knight d5. After e6, I play knight e3, and of course this pawn here is hanging, so he takes. Play rook a to d1, after bishop to c3, attacking this rook. And if I were to move this rook here, this rook is taken, and that's annoying for me. I just take with check, rook takes d8, and rook d1. After rook takes d1, check, knight takes d1. My knight right here hits this bishop, but he doesn't see it. He plays king g7, and I take the bishop, and here my opponent resigned again. So now the score is 2-0. Moving on to game 3, I once again have the black pieces, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, a repeat of the first game, but here he plays bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez or Spanish. You can see he spent a couple of seconds thinking about what to play, And I play a6, the Morphe defense, and after he brings it back to a4, I play knight f6, very standard stuff. After castles, I play d6. Of course, b5 is a move here to push back the bishop. But I panicked. I saw that this pawn would be under attack after this bishop took the knight. Let's just remove this arrow. So I play d6 to solidify my position. After rook e1, b5, bishop to b3, and bishop to e7, just developing my bishop. And after c3, I castle. d4 is played. Bishop to g4, pinning his knight, removing so that his knight cannot actually move to assist in the center. After d5, I take the knight and I move my knight to a5, attacking this bishop, intending to trade. So bishop to c2 and knight b7, of course, intending to go to that c5. So knight d2 and h6, of course, just preventing anything from coming to g5. Knight to f1 and knight to c5 as planned. Of course, this also puts some pressure on this pawn. Put some pressure on this pawn. But he plays knight to g3, overprotecting sit pawn, and I play queen to d7, intending to bring my queen right there to the g4 square to trade. So knight f5, blockading my queen. I play rook f to e8, just moving my rook to the center, just in case. And now he plays queen g3 with a very obvious threat of queen takes g7, or even, say I were to play bishop to f8, he can simply take with the knight on h6, since this pawn is pinned to my king. So I play knight h5, simultaneously attacking the queen and protecting this pawn. After queen to g4, I play g6, and after knight takes h6, I sacrifice the pawn, I move my king to g7. After f4, I trade the queen, since the queens do see each other. And I take this pawn. Right here my opponent is up a pawn. I bring my knight back to d7 and e5. After knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and knight takes e5. I am once again still down a pawn, but I play knight f6. And here, of course, this doesn't work. Oops, Jesus Christ. This doesn't work. This doesn't work, because this rook can simply take my rook. Oh wait, no, Jesus, what am I saying? Even though the rooks do see each other, even though my rook does see the knight, I am drunk. It is, of course, defended by the rook. Yes, finally. So knight to f6 and knight to c6, with a double attack on my bishop. This is not an arrow. Double attack on my bishop, so I play bishop to d6, after rook takes e8, rook takes e8, bishop b3 is played. I play a5, yes, this is hanging, but I'm trying to push here. He doesn't take, instead going for knight d4. Play bishop c5, pinning this knight to his king. Bishop to c2, and knight takes d5. Now material is equal. So rook to d1 play with some potential ideas of moving the king, then moving the knight, and having an attack on this knight. I play knight to f6, h3 is played, and bishop takes d4 with check. After king to h2, instead of recapturing my bishop. Notice how he has very little time, which is probably why he pre-moved king to h2, or just move it because he was panicking. I bring my bishop back to c5, rook to d3, and bishop to d6 check, and my opponent flagged. So currently the score is 3-0 in my favor. Let's move on to game 4. Once again I have the white pieces, e4, this time my opponent plays e5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, this is knight f6, and this is exactly what we saw in the first game. I play knight g5, going for the fried liver. After d5, e takes d5, and knight a5, this is of course the main line. I play bishop to b5, check, c6, d takes c6, bishop takes c6, and of course here there is, I believe, this is the main line. But I play queen to f3, my personal favorite sideline, attacking, pinning this pawn to this rook, and preventing this. Of course, taking the bishop is still a move here. It is a gambit, a known gambit, but my opponent doesn't play that, instead protecting his pawn on c7. I play bishop to a4, getting my bishop out of danger, and h6 is played. After knight to e4, knight takes e4, queen takes e4. I'm going to attack here. This queen is defending, and I have a lot of pressure here. That is, queens don't move like that. Never mind. Alright, So bishop to e6 and knight c3. After bishop to c5, I sacrifice my knight on d5. After bishop takes d5, queen takes d5. My opponent resigned, probably thinking that my attack on his bishop, this pawn, and this pawn was simply too strong. Of course, this is not true, because if his bishop were to move, yes, I am attacking his knight, but his queen holds the knight. So it's perfectly fine, but my opponent resigned here. Now the score is 4-0. Moving on to game 5. e4, once again e5, knight f3, knight c6, and this time d4, the Scotch game. E takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, the Schmidt variation, which I learned from Hikaru Nakamura. Knight takes c6, b takes c6, and e5, just attacking my knight, because it is, of course, attacking the pawn here. Queen e7, pinning the pawn to the king, and indirectly protecting my knight. Queen to e2, and now knight d5, because right here, he is actually threatening to take this. Knight to d5, and c4, chasing my knight, knight to d6, very standard move. And knight to c3. Here I play bishop to a6, pinning this pawn so as to prevent this advance, and also, of course, attacking this pawn. b3 is played, protecting this pawn, and I play rook to d8, just trying to solidify my position. Bishop to b2 played, and d6. After e takes d6, queen takes e2 with check, and bishop takes e2, c takes d6, undoubling my structure and bringing my pawns closer to the center. Long castle is displayed, bishop to e7, and rook h to e1. I castle, bishop to f3, and I play c5, removing this pawn from the bishop's attack. So knight to d5 played. Now, of course, there's a very obvious double attack on my bishop. So I check, and I take the knight. After rook takes d5, I play bishop to b7, attacking this rook, and not really attacking this bishop, but still. So rook to d3, bishop takes f3, trading down, rook takes f3, and the bishop to h6. If you can hear my messages, I am sorry. If not, great. Rook to d3, bishop to f4, of course, just defending this pawn. G3, and I play bishop back to h6, just shuffling, and rook e to d1. I play f6, just giving up the pawn, and we trade, and here he plays bishop to c1. I play rook to e2 check, king to d1, and rook takes f2, trades. I come up, and of course, here he wins another pawn on a7. I take on h2, a4, rook h1 check, king to c2, and rook to h3. King to d3, rook takes g3 check. He hangs another pawn, so I take on b3. After king to d5, rook c3, rook b7, not taking the pawn. h5, a5, and h4. My opponent ran out of time. So that's 5 games down, 5 games to go. I have 5 wins. So moving on to game 6, I have the white pieces, e4, c5 again, knight f3, d6. We see another repeat of the first game, except with a slightly different move order. Here I play knight f3 first instead of bishop to b5 check, but we end up with a similar position after this. I bring my bishop to e3 this time, and after a6, queen d2, putting a battery together, and intending to go here, and of course trade the bishops with a potential attack on h7. So I go with my plan, takes, I take the pawn. Here he is up a piece for a pawn, but I do have some lingering pressure on this pin, and of course a potential attack here if this knight were to move. That is not what I meant to play. Yeah, here we are. So king to g8, just getting out of the pin, and I come over to h3, of course attacking h7. Rook to c8, and rook to a to e1. Of course, my plan here is to just do whatever I can to dislodge this knight. Rook takes c2, rook to d1, queen to c7, and e5. Knight takes c5, and rook to f to e1. Queen c8 offers a queen trade. I play queen h4, avoiding the queen trade. And queen to c4. Here I play rook to e4. Of course, the trick being if knight takes, this is checkmate. So that's not played. I take I play here with a very, this is actually a very nice move. Of course, if I were to take, this is checkmate. Soon after my rooks come back and sacrifice themselves. So I play rook to d4, queen f5 played, g4, and of course now there are no worries of back rank mate. Knight e takes g4, rook takes g4, queen takes g4 check, and unfortunately I did have to trade. So knight right here I am down a rook, but if you look at the clocks I am up 6 seconds. So knight f6, king g3, rook f to c8, I bring my knight back, rook to c1, dodging the rook trade, just dodging. I let him have the pawns. Rook to b3, looking for some kind of counterplay. He attacks my rook. And actually, yes, this is free, but he has 0.8 seconds on the clock, and after rook takes f3, king takes f3, and rook c5, take the pawn, and my opponent runs out of time. Moving on to the next game, I believe this is game 7. My opponent plays d4, I pre-move e5, this is the England gambit. So after d takes e5, I play standard stuff with knight c6, knight f3, and queen here. Of course, yes, I can recapture here, but I go for this check and check. So queen blocks, and I trade the queens on e2, bishop to c5, castles, and knight g7, preparing my own castles. Rook to e1 and castles. Bishop to c4, developing his bishop to a more active square, where he has potential diagonals towards my king. Knight b to d2, just putting some pressure on this pawn. And knight b to d2. After king h8, knight e4. This pawn is hanging, but so is my bishop, so I move my bishop out of the way. Knight e to g5, f6, knight f7 check, king g8, and takes. Here he goes for rook to e8 check. Of course, my rook cannot come back because it is pinned. So knight f8, and f takes g7, king takes g7, bishop h6. I actually missed this plan. And here he wins a piece. So he's up a piece, but once again I am up 10 seconds on the clock. After a few seconds of thinking, he goes back to d2, bishop to c5, just attacking his rook, like so. Rook to e1 check, and king to d6, blocking my own bishop. Maybe some kind of king d5 would have been a bit more tricky, but of course after check, no wait, check doesn't work, I am sorry. But I didn't see that. I played king d6 instead, bishop to f4 check, and king d5 anyway. He brings his, rook up, king to c4, running away. Knight to e5 check, king to d5, c4 check, king b6. Here I trade the knights, and he doesn't take, so I defend my knight, kind of. I scoot over, and here instead of relieving the pressure or taking this free bishop, he opts for rook to f6 after knight to f7, just holding this piece. He once again has 0.8 seconds on the clock, and after knight takes d6, he runs out of time. We're seeing a bit of a theme here, aren't we? Anyways, moving on to game 8, I once again have the white pieces. We see a repeat of the Sicilian, and more or less up to here, but yes, instead of, I believe he played some kind of b5, but here he plays knight g4, attacking and trying to trade off this bishop. He doesn't trade off the bishop after h3, instead playing knight g5, I play knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and I go for my battery strat. Bring my queen to g5, and b5 is played. I bring my knight back, both to dodge this and to bring it to help out in the attack. I ignore the c2 pawn, bring my knight to f4. After rook takes b2, I play rook a d1, hanging a third pawn. Queen trade is offered, but I decline with queen to g3, and rook takes a2. I am now down 3 pawns. h4, queen f6, and h5. After g5, I play knight to h3 with an attack on this pawn. Of course, it's not enough, but it's something. h6 played, defending the pawn, and I take this free pawn over here. After rook to c8, I play rook f d1, doubling on the d file, and rook c to c2 is played. Of course, attacking this pawn. This knight does defend it. I play rook d7, just trying to go for some stuff. Of course, I do hang my knight, and or an exchange at the very least. but my opponent doesn't see it. He plays knight to c4. I bring my rook back, realizing that, and he pins my rook. Of course, it's not free, it is defended by the queen, but I trade and move my king. After rook to c1, threatening checkmate here, I think for a few seconds, 5 seconds, and realize that I have to move my queen to create an escape square for my king. Here this is a fork, and he wins an exchange. He is now up 4 points of material. And after queen to e5 check, I play king f3. After rook takes h3 check, he gives back the exchange. He is still up 2 pawns. So check, check, and he hangs the queen, and my opponent either flags or resigned. Moving on to the ninth game. So we see a repeat of the first game. Oh, here he castles instead of playing his d3. Yes, that pawn is hanging, but after rook here, it's a bit confusing of a position, especially for bullet. I just played bishop c5, rook to e1, and now castles c3 and a d3, and now we more or less have a position from our first game, I believe. After b5, bishop to b3 and d6, opening my bishop. This time I did not opt for this h6 move. Bishop to c2, and now I play h6, and knight b to d2, blocking in his own bishop for some reason. Development-wise, it's not a very strong move. Bishop to g4, knight to f1, and knight to d7, just planning to reroute my knight somewhere, I don't know where, or support this bishop. Knight to g3 and b4, yes, h3, bishop takes f3, and queen takes f3. After b takes c6, b takes c3, and then b takes c3 again. I play f6, just creating this very nice wedge. Knight f5 and king h7, just avoiding any kinds of attacks here, or potentially a sacrifice with these two pieces. Queen to g4 now, and I bring my rook to f7, preventing checkmate. h4 played, queen to g8, just overprotecting the square, making sure I definitely can't be checkmated. And after h5, I play g6, instigating. We have a trade, and knight to g3. I bring my king back to h7, making potential room on the g file for an attack. We trade the bishops, and I bring my rooks over. e5 with check, discover check from this bishop, very nice. And I move my king to h8, and e takes f6. Rook to f7, blocking this pawn from advancing, and of course attacking it. C takes d4, knight takes d4, forking the bishop and the rook. Rook slides over, trades, protect my knight here. And after this trade, I will run my king up. I move my knight to g4. Of course, there's an attack on this pawn. He allows it, and after knight h5 check, king g6, rook e6 check, king f5, rook e5 check, king takes e5. My opponent ran out of time after panicking. Right, okay, so moving on to our last game. The score is now 9-0, and I'm struggling to try and adopt this guy. So, e4, c5, we have another Sicilian. This is a repeat. He plays knight b to d7 instead of bishop to d7, so I do not trade. I castle first, I have 3 castles, I bring my bishop back. And once again I set up this battery to go here. Knight takes, yes, I do lose this pawn, and I hang my queen, which is excellent. I just like collapsed under the pressure of trying to win a 10th game. Rook a to d1, knight to e5, bishop takes e5, b3. My position is completely lost here, but I'm just trying because I have to get this 10th game. After d5, rook f to d1, and bishop takes h2 with check. I play king h1, bishop to f4, I trade the bishops, attack the queen, and double my rooks on the e file. And here my opponent, despite having 28 seconds, flags. I'm still not quite sure what happened here. My opponent definitely is winning, but he just disappeared for some reason. and gave me the 10th game, I suppose. So even though that last game doesn't really count, yes, today I adopted someone in bullet chess. Felt great. And yeah, that is the story of my very first adoption, even though the last game didn't really count. If you've enjoyed today's video, I will try to make more for you. If there's anything for me to talk about, I am not great at chess, but I will do my best. Thank you for watching this 25-minute long video, and have a nice day.